Depression is a confusing and a solitary feeling. It's a state where a feeling of being lost creeps under everything else, covering your entire field of view and coloring it in shades of grey. Ordinary everyday things become a bother. Getting up after bed is a bother. Cleaning, eating, talking to people, taking care of yourself. Doing anything feels exhausting and laden with the feeling of futility. And soon you start rationalizing those feelings. You stop doing things because they don't matter. Stop talking to people because they won't understand. Stop taking care of yourself because no one cares. You eventually start cycling through the same series of thoughts over and over until it becomes so ingrained and so real that you completely forget how the picture looks without all the filters. It is a characteristic flaw of human beings that we only notice what we think is noteworthy, see value in things we want to have value. So it is just that easy to look at the world through the lens of despair and find everything meaningless. Of course, the process isn't as transparent nor pronounced in its onset. Instead, it is quite subtle when it begins, and it's the manifestation which comes as a surprise. It starts with one negative thought, one comment, one justification, and from there, the fall begins. Before you know it, you're a prisoner in your own head, policed constantly by your own thoughts about the world outside, unable to face them, unable to get out. But if it was that easy to get in, why is it often so difficult to get out? Sangatsu no Lion is a show which handles this predicament sincerely. Sincerely because it feels genuine. There's an instance in episode 12 where the protagonist Ray is sitting in his apartment working on some shogi problems as a pot of boiling water sits on the stove. A sneeze, another, and just like that, the feeling of loneliness comes rushing in, washing away the orange sunset hue and taking all the warmth away from the scene. The sounds from the air conditioner and the clock grow louder, each tick more uncomfortable, more piercing than the last. As that feeling starts overwhelming him and turning everything upside down, he's forced to rush out of the room. Because if he were to face it, everything, all the excuses, rationalizations and stories, the pieces he had used to hold himself together, they all would have been swept away, leaving nothing for him to hide behind. So he starts walking away from it and keeps walking until nightfall. We watch as he sits alone under a streetlight by the river and compares the Kawamoto house with the Gatatsu, contemplating the cold loneliness of his daily life. But despite all the pondering, he never really faces it. Instead, the monologue swiftly shifts into shogi as this fundamental issue is transposed to a career problem. And Ray once again manages to escape into shogi, finally managing to lock these feelings away until the next time. The reason why Ray's struggle feels genuine and relatable is largely because of how often he acknowledges his feelings through his monologues, and how each of those pieces of dialogue are accompanied by appropriate visuals. Shaft's signature style, which focuses on various objects during close-ups, gives more clarity and flavor to the emotions. Take for example the recurring motif of bubbles. In the beginning, they're associated with drowning, with someone falling deeper and deeper underwater, which metaphorically paints Ray's depression. During shogi matches, they often symbolize contemplation, ideas surfacing from the depths of his mind. Other times, they denote Ray losing his footing or a surge of emotions coming to a boil. And at the end of the show, they convey anticipation of something new about to surface. Sangatsu repeatedly uses a number of such subtle cues to characterize emotions. It presents the scene taking place on both sides of the mask and punctuates them with these visuals. This creates transparency between us and the characters and lets us easily sympathize with them. But it's not just the direction which is at work here. The credit also goes to Umino Chiko's remarkable ability to vividly paint the pathetic nature of the characters. Let's take the aftermath of the match between Rei and Matsunaga from episode 9. Throughout this small arc, Rei had been trying to comprehend what 40 years of playing shogi would look like. What it would do to a person. Would it be reflected in the way they hold the pieces, the look in their eyes, or the way they carry themselves? He thinks of all these things that would be weighing on the old man's every move, but once the match begins, the ugliness makes his appearance. Instead of a stance of dignity and pride, Matsunaga trembles and wobbles, shifting from one strategy to another. He even tries to deceive Rei by putting on an act, and at the very end, he only gracelessly admits defeat. But his undignified way of playing shogi in what's supposed to be his final game, it gives a certain beauty to his confession later on, that despite the perfect final stage prepared for him, he wanted to keep going. And when asked if he loved shogi, he gave the perfect answer: "I don't know." But a minute later, he confesses that he wants to keep going so that he wouldn't have to do chores at home. And that right there is what I mean by the pathetic nature. It is this mishmash of virtues and faults in a character, and how it is often difficult to tell which is which. Now, while this was expressed here in a more playful way, the other side of it, however, is rather tragic. Human beings are troublesome creatures, and they can hurt others by merely existing. On top of which, they're often self-seeking, impatient, forceful, and ignorant. But at times when they are considerate, when they are sensitive of the things around them and do decide to help others, their compassion itself can lead to ruin. Because sometimes doing good to others and to even doing good to oneself is amazingly destructive. This is Kiriyama Rei's predicament. His experiences at his foster home have left him emotionally incapacitated. He's no longer sure if he's helping others or being a bother, whether he's being kind to them or hurting them. So he isolates himself, and when he interacts with others, he's always wary of his own presence. Hence, he never truly communicates. It is a recurring theme in Sangatsu that human relationships are a mutual exchange where both sides give each other something, however valuable or useless it might seem to them. And to be reliable implies that you rely on others too. But for someone who isn't sure of themselves, who doesn't know if what they're offering is a curse or a blessing, how should they participate? There's no specific answer to that. The least you can do is to be honest and observant and leave the rest to your own nature. Sangatsu puts the subtlety of this into perspective. Throughout many situations in the show, Rei often acts as a passive observer. Whether or not he's actively involved in the situation, he's always contemplating things around him, including his own thoughts and actions. And even though he's often misguided about his own impression, over the course of 22 episodes, you can see how his perception evolves. Each arc in the show often ends in such an exchange where Rei gains a piece for himself. In the beginning, it is the grief, the emotions he had chased out after the accident. By just being there at the house, he brings the gift of his presence, and later, as a spectator by his side, he remembers a painful but dear memory of the grief he should have treasured, and a subtle but strong bond is formed between them. With Nikaido, it is Rei's relentless pursuit to get better at shogi which inspires him, and in return, it is Nikaido's unyielding passion which humbles Rei. With Matsunaga, he bears witness to the pathetic nature, and with Yasui, he accepts it in himself. And in the long Shimada arc afterward, these exchanges culminate to a beautiful conclusion. Shimada is someone who suffers through shogi, mentally and physically. Gut-wrenching pains and nightmares hang over his head. He's constantly haunted by the expectations of his people, of his own choice to pursue shogi as a career instead of a peaceful life in the village, and the huge cost he's paying for it. But through it all, the pains, the adversities and the defeats, he stands strong and he keeps going. Fueled by the curiosity to see what pushes him, and later by the similarity of his situation, Rei decides to stick along. And between them, the first exchange is that of perspectives. For Rei, it is getting input from a strong Class A player, and for Shimada, it is a possible chance to get a peek into Soya's mind. And as they keep interacting, we move on to honesty, their love for Shogi, and finally, compassion. What's interesting in these exchanges is that Rei is often oblivious to his own contributions. He's unaware of the gift of his own presence, his kindness, and the hard work and dedication he has for Shogi. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with that. Our greatest virtues are often the ones we're unconscious of, and just like our flaws, they're often reflected in the people around us. So while Rei isn't able to find them by looking in, he finds them through others. Whether it is the grief of loss and the warmth of a family, the passion and resolve toward a career, the love-hate relationship with it, or the ugly reality of it, it is all filtered and reflected back at him, and while looking into that reflection, he finds himself. It is difficult to deal with things like depression, losing a loved one, or growing up without any help. To understand the nature of people around you, the hostility, the blame, or the indifference they might direct at you. And perhaps the hardest among all is to comprehend the indifference of suffering. To simply accept the tragedy befalling you as a mere coincidence, as a random twist of fate when it has caused such devastating damage to your personal world. In such trying times when the outside world doesn't make sense, we often direct our sights within us and wield our own perception as a weapon, with the intent to destroy the only thing that is left. We are right in doing so, and we know it. And it is precisely why it is so difficult to get out of that state. But in order to change, we must accept it, the world and ourselves, for being this way. Because when we are busy attacking ourselves and damning our own existence, we turn our eyes away from the world, from its people, and from our own reflection in it. And we forget that the one we condemn is a friend and a fellow sufferer. Now, it is never easy to cast your judgments aside and embrace it. It takes a great deal of courage, and it does not happen instantly. Sangatsu proposes that the way to handle this is by being observant, to watch carefully without judgments, not just yourself, but the people around you as well. Because we are always influencing each other, and as a result, a part of ourselves is manifested in those around us. And by looking into that reflection, we can gain a different perspective of ourselves, and with it, courage to take a single step forward. And once we start moving step by step, we'll begin to notice that the people around us are also trying to find their reflections in us. Perhaps then we might realize that we are not alone in our suffering, in our misfortunes, and in our ugliness. That despite our existential isolation, we're all moving together toward the same light. And perhaps then we'll wake up one day and notice that a little bit of color has returned to our world. And for now, that little bit is fine.